I've had my share of close calls and scary moments in my life, but nothing has ever come close to this. When I look back on this whole thing, this terrifying memory, it doesn't start in the woods with a strange sound. It starts somewhere much simpler, somewhere you wouldn't expect. I guess it really all began with an Amazon Prime Day deal back in 2022. I'd been a solo camper for years, a real enthusiast. But I was always a cheapskate when it came to my gear, making do with old, heavy stuff that got the job done but wasn't exactly luxurious. But that summer, I finally decided to splurge. I got myself a top-of-the-line Big Agnes copper spur tent and a high-tech Thermarest sleeping bag I'd been dreaming about for ages. I remember unboxing it all in my living room, feeling the ultralight fabric and seeing the quality of the construction, and thinking that with gear this good, I'd be untouchable, completely safe out there in the wild. It's funny and a little sad looking back, how a thin sheet of nylon and some goose down can give you such a dangerous and false sense of security. As soon as I held that new gear, there was really only one place that came to mind for its first trip. I think a part of me had already decided I was going deep into the backcountry of Glacier National Park in Montana. I had originally planned the trip for the last weekend of July, right after my new toys arrived. But some unexpected emergency at work forced me to push it back. By the time I had a clear schedule again, it was the last weekend of August. The timing was actually perfect. The weather was still warm enough for a comfortable trip, but the peak season crowds had thinned out, which was exactly how I liked it. I packed light but smart with my new tent and sleeping bag, my trusty water filter, bear spray, a good knife, and enough food for a few days. The tent itself was a thing of beauty, famous for its ultralight construction and its thin, almost translucent stargazer mesh body, designed so you could see the night sky on a clear night right from your sleeping bag. I couldn't wait to be out there, completely alone under a canopy of stars. The beginning of that trip was deceptive in its peace. For 2 days, everything felt exactly right, just like I had hoped it would when I was planning it all out. The scenery in Glacier is just unreal, all these towering, jagged peaks and crystal-clear alpine lakes, with miles of untouched wilderness stretching out in every direction. I found a perfect, secluded campsite in a small clearing, tucked between a massive fallen log and a thick patch of pine trees that shielded me from the wind. It was quiet and completely isolated, exactly the kind of peace I had been craving. I remember on the second afternoon, I hiked up to a high ridge that overlooked a vast, U-shaped valley carved by ancient glaciers. I just sat there for over an hour, watching the clouds drift by, feeling the sheer scale of the place. There was no sign of human life anywhere, no roads, no buildings, nothing but raw, powerful nature. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of calm and belonging, a feeling that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was on the third night that the peace I'd been soaking in finally broke. I had just finished my rehydrated dinner and was letting the fire die down to a bed of glowing embers when I noticed the woods had gone completely and utterly silent. If you've ever camped before, you know there's always some background noise, the wind in the branches, the chirping of crickets, the scurrying of small animals in the brush. But this was a dead, heavy silence, the kind that feels like the entire forest is holding its breath, waiting for something. I felt it before I even saw it. That weird, primal instinct that tells you something is wrong. The feeling of being watched. I just sat there by the dying fire, my hand resting on my knee, listening. my breath fogging in the cold night air as every nerve in my body went on high alert. And then, just at the edge of the dying firelight, I saw them. 2 glowing orbs were floating in the darkness, low to the ground, perfectly still, and reflecting the last of my fire's embers. At first, my brain didn't register what I was seeing. But then the realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It was the eyes of a cougar. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a second. If you don't know much about mountain lions, the main thing to know is that they are silent ambush hunters. If you actually see one before it attacks, it's not because you're good, it's because the cat has allowed you to see it, and you're already in a very, very bad situation. My mind raced through the survival training checklist. Don't run, don't turn your back, make yourself look bigger. I slowly reached for my can of bear spray, my fingers closing around the cold metal, while keeping my eyes locked on the cat. It didn't move an inch, just watched me with that unnerving, predatory stillness. After what felt like an eternity, the eyes just vanished, melting back into the darkness as silently as they had appeared. I wanted to believe it was gone for good, but I knew better. Cougars don't just give up. They stalk their prey for hours, sometimes even days, waiting for the perfect moment of weakness. I knew I couldn't just sit out in the open all night, so I began a slow, deliberate retreat. I stood up without turning my back to the darkness, and step by agonizing step, I backed into my new tent, the sound of my feet on the pine needles sounding deafeningly loud. I zipped the doors shut in one quick, loud motion that made my own heart jump. I knew the thin nylon walls were nothing more than a psychological barrier, but it was all I had. As I lay there in the dark, the silence outside felt menacing. A little while later, a sliver of moonlight broke through the clouds, dimly illuminating the tent's thin mesh ceiling. And then I saw it. A dark, heavy shadow passed directly over me, blotting out the stars for a split second before it was gone. The very feature I had been so excited about, the stargazer mesh, had just become a terrifying window, reminding me how fragile my only shelter truly was. For the next few hours, I just lay there wide awake, listening to the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of the cougar circling my campsite. And then a new, horrifying problem began to brew. A human problem that felt both absurd and deadly serious. My stomach started cramping with a sick, twisting pressure that was getting worse by the minute. I needed to go, and I needed to go bad. The thought of trying to deal with that situation inside my brand new, expensive tent was almost as terrifying as the thought of what was waiting for me outside. I spent 15 agonizing minutes debating with myself, my body screaming at me while my mind raced through the horrifying logistics of either option. Finally, I made my choice. I had to get out, get it over with, and get back inside as fast as humanly possible. I unzipped the tent as slowly and quietly as I could, my flashlight, wipes, and bear spray clutched in my hands. The air outside was crisp and still, and as I stepped out and scanned the darkness with my light, I saw nothing. The second I crouched down a few yards from my tent, that feeling of dread was still hanging over me. I realized what a horrible, stupid mistake I had made. My flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement, and when I snapped the light over, I saw it. The cougar was still there, crouched low in the tall grass at the edge of the clearing, its golden eyes reflecting my light back at me, its muscles coiled like a spring. It hadn't left at all. It had just been sitting there, waiting patiently. every single muscle in my body locked up. I knew if I ran, it would trigger its prey drive. If I turned my back, it would lunge. I was just a piece of meat, and the predator was deciding if it was time to eat. I could see its tail flick once, then twice, a slow, hypnotic motion in the otherwise still night. And then, without a sound, it rose to a standing position, its eyes never leaving mine. I forced myself to move, slowly and deliberately, backing step by step toward my tent, keeping the light in its eyes, my own breath shallow and shaky. It didn't move until I had ducked back inside the tent and zipped it shut. Once I was back inside, the adrenaline hit me all at once, and my whole body started shaking uncontrollably. Outside, I could hear the soft padding of its paws on the ground again, circling my tent, closer this time. So close I thought I might feel the brush of its fur against the nylon. Then the sound just stopped, and the woods fell into that same dead, heavy silence from before. That was the worst part, the not knowing. Was it still out there, just feet away, waiting in silence? Or had it moved on? I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Just lay there wide awake with my knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other, every nerve in my body screaming, my ears straining to hear the slightest sound over the pounding of my own heart. By the time the first sliver of gray light crept into the sky, I felt like I had aged 10 years. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent, poking my head out as slowly and quietly as possible to scan the area. There was no movement, no glowing eyes, nothing. But then I saw the tracks in the soft dirt and morning dew. The area around my tent was covered in fresh paw prints, dozens of them, circling the tent over and over again. The cougar had been here all night long, testing my shelter, walking the perimeter, waiting. I got out of the tent and followed the tracks with my eyes, my stomach turning to ice. I could see where it had sat, and where it had paced back and forth, and where it had even laid down in the grass for a while. Some of the prints led directly to the side of my tent, right up against the nylon wall where my head had been resting just inches away on the other side. Seeing those tracks so close was all the motivation I needed. I have never packed up a campsite so fast in my entire life. I kept my bear spray in one hand as I tore down my tent, my eyes constantly scanning the woods, the ridgeline, the shadows. The sun was fully up by the time I made it back to the trailhead, but I didn't feel a single moment of relief until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. I had always loved solo camping for the quiet and the solitude. But that night in Glacier taught me what it really means to be truly, terrifyingly alone. There's a specific kind of quiet you can only find when you're truly in the middle of nowhere. The kind of deep, profound silence that you just can't get in the city. I used to love that feeling, the isolation of it all. My girlfriend and I were big on wild camping, the kind where you hike deep into the woods, away from any crowded campgrounds, and set up your tent where no one else is around. But after what happened back in 2013, in a remote part of the Cherokee National Forest, I don't think I'll ever camp in a place like that again. That trip taught me that some quiet places are quiet for a reason, and that sometimes when you think you're alone, you're the furthest thing from it. Looking back on that day, the warning signs were all there. We just didn't know how to read them. We had planned a weekend trip to a spot we found on a map, right near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It wasn't an official campsite, just a secluded clearing near a cliffside that promised an incredible view of the mountains. We drove up early that day, parked the car a few miles from the main trails, and hiked deeper into the forest than we ever had before. The spot we picked was perfect, at least we thought it was. It was flat, hidden by a thick wall of brush, and just close enough to the cliff's edge to give us that amazing view. As we were hiking in, I remember spotting a few spent bullet casings on the ground near a clearing, which wasn't totally unusual for a national forest. But it still gave me a little pause. Later on, when we went to filter water from a small stream, we found an old, messy fire pit with a bunch of empty, cheap beer cans and crushed cigarette packs littered around. I remember dismissing it all at the time, a huge red flag that I deliberately looked past, figuring it was just a place where some locals liked to party. I never considered we might be setting up our tent right in the middle of their territory. By the time we had our tent set up and a small fire going, the sun was starting to set, painting the whole valley in these incredible colors. We sat by the flames, cooking our food and just enjoying the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. There was no cell service, no marked trails, just us and the vast, empty wilderness. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, how peaceful it was. The air was clean. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the chirping of crickets, and the only lights were the stars that were just starting to pop out in the darkening sky. We stayed up for a couple of hours, just talking and enjoying the quiet, before we decided to douse the fire and call it a night. It was probably around 10 o'clock when we were getting settled into our sleeping bags in the tent, when the first gunshot echoed through the valley. It wasn't super close, but it was loud enough to make both of us freeze instantly. The sharp, cracking sound seemed to cut right through the peaceful quiet of the woods. My girlfriend and I just looked at each other in the dark, our minds racing through the possibilities. Maybe it was just late-night hunters, or some idiots doing target practice. We waited, listening intently, but all we heard was the ringing in our ears and the heavy silence that had fallen over the woods again. After a few minutes, we started to relax a little. But then we heard something else. At first, it was just a faint murmur, but it was unmistakably the sound of men's voices, loud and slurring their words, the kind of rowdy sound you hear outside a bar at closing time. My first thought was actually relief, figuring it was just some other guys camping nearby who were blowing off some steam. But then the voices started to get louder, and a cold wave of dread began to wash over me. They were getting closer. I carefully unzipped the tent just a crack and peered out into the darkness. My heart sank into my stomach when I saw the beams of several flashlights swirling and bouncing between the trees, coming directly in our direction. There were maybe 4 or 5 of them, and they were making no effort to be quiet, just crashing through the underbrush. From the dark silhouettes cast by their own lights, I caught a brief, horrifying glimpse of a rifle slung over one of their shoulders. Our tent was tucked away behind some thick brush, and since we had doused our fire, there was no glow for them to see. For now, they had no idea we were there. But they were still getting closer, maybe just 20 meters away. Then, another gunshot went off, this time much, much closer. And I heard one of the men start yelling at the guy who fired, pissed off about him shooting so close to them. From the way they were arguing and slurring their words, it was clear that these weren't just some weekend campers. They were drunk or high on something hard, and they were armed and reckless. My girlfriend gripped my arm in the dark, her knuckles white. We didn't need to speak to know what we were both thinking. We had to make a choice, and neither option was good. If we stayed put in the tent, we were gambling that they would just pass by without noticing us. If we tried to run, we risked making noise, being seen in the dark, and possibly getting shot. We looked at each other one last time in the faint moonlight filtering through the tent, and we made our decision. We moved as fast and as silently as we possibly could, not even thinking about packing anything. I just grabbed a small bag with our phones and my hunting knife before we slipped out of the back of the tent. We used the thick brush as cover, crawling on our hands and knees toward a dense cluster of low-hanging bushes about 8 meters away from our campsite. We flattened ourselves into the dirt, pushing our way under the branches, the leaves and twigs scratching at our faces. The ground was cold and damp, and the air smelled like rotting leaves as we lay there, barely daring to breathe. A few moments later, the men reached our camp. I could hear their heavy boots crunching over twigs and dead leaves as they stumbled into the clearing. One of them let out a loud, slurred laugh, and then another one kicked something. The unmistakable clatter of our cooler and the bottles inside spilling onto the ground. I could hear them talking, their voices thick with whatever drug they were on, wondering who the hell would leave all this good stuff out here. Then I heard the sound of metal smashing against plastic over and over again, followed by the sickening sound of our camp chairs snapping. They were destroying our gear, bashing in our cooler, stomping on our tent, and rifling through our belongings. Another gunshot went off, this one so close it made me flinch violently. A different voice started shouting at the shooter again, telling him to stop wasting ammo. We just stayed completely still under that bush, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing that if a single one of them shined their flashlight in our direction, it would all be over. The attack on our camp lasted for what felt like an eternity, as they tore through everything we had, taking some of our food and our sleeping bags. At one point, one of them walked off to the edge of the clearing, stopping just a few feet from where we were hiding to relieve himself. The smell of stale beer and sweat drifted over to us, and I had to physically bite my lip to keep from making a sound. I gripped the handle of my knife so hard my knuckles ached, my body tense and ready to fight, knowing it would be useless. Eventually, it seemed like they just got bored. Their flashlight beams flickered away into the woods, and their voices faded into the distance, until all we could hear was the pounding of our own hearts. We didn't move for hours, just stayed curled up under that bush, frozen by the cold and the fear. I don't know how, but at some point, the sheer exhaustion took over, and we both drifted off into a fitful, terrified sleep, right there in our hiding spot. The first thing I remember when I woke up was the cold, and the feeling of my body being stiff and sore in a way I'd never experienced before. The first traces of morning light were cutting through the trees, and my girlfriend was stirring next to me. We sat up slowly, trying to process everything that had happened. And that's when I realized, with a surge of nausea, that if we had crawled just 3 feet further back in the dark, we would have gone straight over the edge of the cliff. The ground right behind us was loose and uneven, dropping off into a steep, rocky ravine. One wrong move in the chaos of the night, 1 inch further, and we would have never woken up. Our campsite looked like a tornado had hit it. Our tent ripped open, and our gear either stolen or smashed to pieces for no reason. The sheer malice of the destruction was what scared me the most. We grabbed what little was left of our things and started the miserable hike back to the car, flinching at every sound the forest made. As soon as we got a bar of cell service, we knew we had to report it. We found the nearest ranger station, and I told the park ranger everything: the gunshots, the armed men, the way they had trashed our site. The ranger's face stayed neutral the whole time, like he'd heard stories like this before. He just sighed and told us that the area had a history of problems with illegal campers and drug users, people looking for a place to get high where they wouldn't be found. He took our statement, but it was clear from his weary expression that this was just another report to be filed away. He said they'd send someone to check the area, but we both knew that those guys were long gone, like ghosts in the woods. We didn't talk much on the long drive home. We were just lucky to be alive, and we knew it. That was the last time we ever went wild camping. After that, we only stuck to established campgrounds, places with other people and park rangers and some illusion of safety. Because what I learned that night is that when you're truly out there in the middle of nowhere, you are completely and utterly on your own. Back in 2013, I was living through something that completely changed my life. An event you might have even seen on the news back then because it was everywhere for a while. The West fertilizer plant explosion. I don't like to talk about it much, but it was a real-life tragedy that completely rewired my brain. The blast was a deep, chest-rattling boom that blew out our windows and sent a shockwave through the house that felt like the world was ending. For days after, my hearing was muffled and distant, and the constant sound of sirens and helicopters became a permanent soundtrack to a life that suddenly felt unstable and dangerous. That event left me with a deep-seated anxiety and a nasty case of stress-induced asthma, a physical reminder of the panic that had settled deep in my bones. The doctors all told me the same thing, that I needed to find ways to manage it, suggesting that fresh air and outdoor activity could help. So when my friends, Jake, Lena, and Matt, started inviting me on their hiking trips, I eventually said yes, mostly just to get them to stop asking. This trip to Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri was my third with them, and I was finally starting to get it. The first couple of trips had been a struggle, my city-dweller brain on high alert for every snap of a twig. But slowly, I was learning how to pitch a tent, how to cook over a fire, and how to just exist in the quiet of the woods. I was starting to feel like I could breathe again, like maybe I was finally clawing my way back to some version of normal. What I didn't realize then was that the woods had its own kind of chaos, a kind that you can't just run from. The first day of the hike went just about how you'd expect. A little tiring, but mostly peaceful. We got to the trailhead on a Friday afternoon in late summer. The air still warm, but with a certain crispness that hinted at the coming autumn. We made it to our planned campsite by early evening, a quiet little spot next to a creek that was barely a trickle. As my friends started setting up the tents, I wandered down to the water's edge, just taking a moment for myself. That's when I saw it, wedged between two mossy rocks near the bank. It was a small wooden figurine, no bigger than my hand, carved from a dark, cracked piece of wood. It had a vaguely human shape, but was covered in these strange, intricate symbols that I didn't recognize. A brittle tension snapped into the air the second I saw it, making the fine hairs on my arms feel like tiny, vibrating needles. When I showed it to Matt, he just laughed it off, calling it some kind of hillbilly art before turning back to his tent. I don't know why, but instead of tossing it back, I slipped it into the side pocket of my backpack, a decision that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Later that night, as we were all sitting around the fire we had built, I remember feeling genuinely relaxed for the first time in a long time. The flames were crackling, my friends' voices were a low, comforting murmur, and the woods around us were alive with the sound of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves. For the first time in months, I felt like my lungs were working properly. It was in the middle of one of Jake's long, rambling stories that I first noticed it. It's something your brain registers before you can even put a name to it, a shift in the atmosphere. But then it hit me with a sudden, chilling clarity. The woods had gone completely silent. The crickets had stopped their chirping, the wind had died down, and not a single leaf was rustling. The only sound left in the entire world was the crackle of our fire, which now felt deafeningly loud in the oppressive stillness. It was out of the corner of my eye that I first saw it. A faint light flickering between the trees, maybe 100 yards away from our camp. At first, I thought it had to be another camper's flashlight, or maybe a reflection from their fire. I whispered to the others, asking if they saw it too. And the tense silence from my friends was all the confirmation I needed. The light grew a little stronger, but it wasn't moving like a flashlight. It was pulsing with a strange, uneven rhythm, illuminating the dense brush in brief, sickly flashes. Looking back, I know we never should have gone toward it. That every horror movie cliché warns you against exactly that. But when you're in a group, you make dumb decisions, a kind of shared denial that makes you feel braver than you are. Matt was the one who broke the silence, joking that maybe they had extra beer, and the thought of it just being other people, other normal campers, made the whole situation feel a little less ominous. We grabbed our flashlights and started moving slowly and carefully through the underbrush. Each footstep we took just amplified the feeling of dread, the air growing heavier and colder the deeper we went into the trees. Then a strange smell hit us, a thick, metallic, coppery odor that was so strong it made me gag. It was like the smell of old pennies and fresh meat, the smell of blood. My heart started pounding in my chest as we pushed past a final line of thick bushes and stepped into a small, secluded clearing. In the center of the clearing was a huge, grotesque structure, maybe 10 feet tall, carved from dark, gnarled wood and covered in the same strange symbols as the figurine I had found. A large bonfire was burning in front of it, casting long, dancing shadows across the clearing. And standing around the fire were figures, at least a dozen of them, all perfectly still. At first, my brain tried to tell me they were mannequins. But then I saw them sway in unison, a slow, rocking motion that turned my stomach to ice. They were all naked, their skin glistening in the firelight, covered from head to toe in something dark and crimson. It was blood, thick and still dripping. I remember my mind just trying to process it all, trying to find a logical explanation when there wasn't one. The chanting started then, a low, guttural sound that wasn't a language I had ever heard before. It crawled under my skin and settled there, a vibration of pure malice. My eyes darted around the clearing, and I saw them. Animal carcasses, deer and rabbits, strung up on wooden poles at the edge of the clearing, their blood dripping down onto the figures below. Lena grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin, whispering that we needed to leave right now. It was in that moment of panicked retreat that Jake's foot came down hard on a dry branch, the loud snap echoing through the clearing like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. Every single figure turned their head toward us in perfect, silent unison, their movements not startled or fast, but slow and impossibly deliberate. And then one of them, a tall, gaunt figure whose hair was matted with blood, stepped forward from the group. Its lips curled back into a slow, chilling smile that wasn't human. and then it moved, lunging straight for us. That was all it took for our bodies to just react, our brains shutting down as pure survival instinct took over. We ran like our lives depended on it, because I have no doubt that they did. Branches whipped against my face, my legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air. But I didn't stop. None of us did. We tore through the underbrush, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly, barely illuminating the uneven ground ahead. Behind us, I could hear them moving with an unnatural speed. The sound of snapping twigs and heavy bodies crashing through the trees getting closer. My chest started to tighten, not just from the running, but from that familiar, terrifying grip of panic. I hadn't had an asthma attack in months, but I could feel one creeping in now. We finally burst through the trees and back into our own campsite, and for a split second, I felt a wave of relief. But then, my flashlight beam caught something on the side of my tent. There were dozens of red handprints smudged and streaked across the fabric, as if someone had been caressing it over and over again while we were gone. We didn't even think about our gear after that. We just grabbed our backpacks and whatever else was in arm's reach and ran again, this time for the main trail that would lead us back to the car, 6 miles away. Primal fear was the only thing in my head during that entire run back, a desperate animal need to just get out of the dark. Every crunch of leaves and every snap of a branch made my skin crawl, the feeling of being watched never once leaving me. By the time we finally saw the faint outline of the car in the pre-dawn light, I thought my legs were going to give out completely. We didn't slow down until we were all safely inside with the doors locked, all of us just gasping for air, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. But finally, the engine roared to life, and we just drove, not stopping until we were halfway across the state. The next morning, we went straight to the authorities and told them everything. But a search team went out and found nothing. No bonfire, no wooden idol, no blood, no handprints on our abandoned tents. It was as if none of it had ever been there. That was my last hiking trip. Weeks later, when I was finally unpacking my gear, the little wooden figurine I had found fell out of my backpack and onto the floor. As I picked it up, I saw that one of the strange symbols carved into its side was a perfect, miniature version of the bloody handprints that had been on my tent. I haven't set foot in the woods since, and I never will again. You know, people talk a lot about the beauty of nature, and they're not wrong. It's breathtaking. But what they don't always talk about is how unforgiving it is, how it doesn't care about you at all. That's a lesson you have to learn firsthand. It doesn't care if you're a good person, or if you're prepared, or if you have plans for the future. It just is. I thought I understood that on an intellectual level. But I was wrong. Back in 2005, my friends and I set out on what we thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. A week-long backpacking expedition through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alaska. We went there looking to witness something raw and powerful, and we found it, just not in the way any of us had ever expected. That trip taught me that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world isn't a predator with teeth and claws, but simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time when nature decides to move. I think we felt completely prepared for anything the wild could throw at us, a kind of youthful confidence that now seems dangerously naive. There were 5 of us in total, all experienced hikers who had spent months training for this specific trip. Our goal was to document the migration of the porcupine caribou herd, which is one of the largest and most spectacular land migrations on the entire planet. We carried everything we needed on our backs: food for a week, sub-zero tents, satellite phones, and bear spray. One of my friends, Dave, the most experienced of all of us, also carried a high-powered rifle for protection. I remember him insisting on it, and the rest of us agreeing without much thought. The weight of that rifle on his pack was a constant, almost comforting presence during the first few days. A heavy piece of steel that represented our illusion of control. A tool we believed could solve any singular threat that might come our way, like a bear or a lone wolf. We truly believed we were ready for anything. The journey to get there was an adventure in itself. We flew into Kaktovik, a small Inupiat village on the northern Alaskan coast that felt like the edge of the world, before making our way south into the vast, untouched tundra. The landscape was surreal and profoundly empty, just rolling, treeless hills and wide open valleys that seemed to stretch on forever under a sky that felt impossibly large. There were no roads and no trails to follow, just our GPS, our topographic maps, and our own instincts. The first few days of the journey were everything we had hoped for. Incredibly difficult, exhilarating, and steeped in a silence so deep, it felt like you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears. The Arctic summer meant we had nearly 24 hours of daylight, a phenomenon that messed with your internal clock and gave the whole experience a strange, dreamlike quality. The quiet was the most powerful thing, an absence of man-made sound that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling at the same time. It was on the 5th day, I think, that our trip changed from an adventure into something else entirely. We had reached a steep, narrow ravine where a stream of glacial meltwater had carved its way through the frozen earth over centuries. It seemed like the perfect place to stop and collect some water before we pushed on to find a spot to set up camp for the night. It was as we were filling our bottles that we first heard it. It was a low rumble in the distance, like the sound of far-off thunder. But the sky above us was perfectly clear. We had seen small clusters of caribou over the past few days, so we just figured it was another group passing by on the other side of the ridge. But then, the vibrations started. I could feel them through the soles of my boots, a deep, rhythmic tremor that was steadily growing stronger, a feeling that shook the very ground we were standing on. In a place that open, you'd think there would be somewhere to run, but we were already in the worst possible spot. My stomach sank as I realized that this wasn't just a handful of caribou passing by. This was the herd. Thousands upon thousands of animals, all moving as one single, unstoppable force of nature. And from the direction of the sound and the trembling of the earth, it was clear they were heading straight for the ravine we were standing in. Panic hit all of us at once. The ravine was about 40 feet wide, flanked on both sides by 6-foot rock walls that were too steep and slick with damp moss to climb in a hurry. We turned to try and run back up the long, sloping entrance to the ravine, but it was already too late. The first of the caribou were appearing over the ridge, their eyes wide with a primal, instinctual fear, their bodies tense and moving with a blind, desperate rush. We were trapped in a funnel, and the stampede was pouring straight down it, right toward us. There really wasn't any time to think after that, only to react. I pressed my body against the cold, jagged rock wall as hard as I could, trying to make myself as small and as thin as possible as the others did the same. The sound was unreal and overwhelming, the thunder of thousands of hooves pounding the earth. the sharp, panicked breaths of the animals, the clatter of their antlers hitting each other. The ground shook beneath us like a violent earthquake, and the air filled with a thick, musky smell of the herd. I remember glancing over at Dave, seeing that powerful rifle slung uselessly over his back. It was just a pathetic little stick, a child's toy in the face of this overwhelming, indifferent force. In that moment, I understood that our ultimate tool for protection, our symbol of control over the wild, was completely and utterly meaningless out here. A huge bull caribou passed so close to me that I could feel the heat radiating from its body, its massive antlers nearly clipping my face as it thundered past. And then, through the blur of fur and antlers, I heard a loud, sickening crack that cut through the chaos. I forced myself to look and saw a young bull, maybe 2 years old, go down just a few feet away from where we were hiding. Its front leg was bent at an impossible angle, snapped clean under the immense weight and pressure of the herd. It let out a pained cry and tried to push itself up, but there was no stopping the flood of bodies. The others didn't slow down or swerve around it. They just ran over it, their hooves a relentless crushing force. I had to look away, my stomach churning as the tragic, brutal reality of the wild played out right in front of my eyes. The stampede just kept coming, more and more caribou barreling past us, their bodies brushing so close that I could feel the rush of air as they passed. We weren't just standing in nature anymore. We were trapped inside it, completely helpless against its raw power. Just as suddenly as it had all started, the thunder of the hooves began to recede into the distance. The last of the caribou rushed past us, and the violent shaking of the ground subsided into a low, fading tremor. We stood there for a long moment, completely silent, our bodies still pressed against the rock wall as we tried to process what had just happened. My ears were ringing, and it took a few seconds for the profound silence of the tundra to settle back in. Slowly, hesitantly, we all pushed ourselves away from the wall. I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, my legs shaking so badly, I was surprised they were still supporting me. We had survived by mere inches. One of my friends just sat down hard on the ground, running his hands over his face, while another just stared blankly into the distance, his eyes wide with shock. The air was thick with dust and the smell of animals, and everything felt eerily still, as if the land itself was holding its breath in the aftermath. We didn't stay in that ravine for long, as the sight of the young, dying bull was too much to bear. Its chest was still rising and falling in slow, ragged movements. A final, quiet tragedy in a place that had just been filled with so much violent noise. We just turned and kept moving, quickly and quietly, out of that place of chaos and as far away from it as we could get. No one said a word for what must have been over an hour. What could you even say after something like that? We had just been caught in the middle of one of the most powerful migrations on Earth. And somehow, we were all still standing, completely unharmed. We spent the next few days following the herd from a safe distance, watching from high ridges as they crossed icy rivers and grazed in wide, open valleys. It was an incredible sight. The kind of thing most people will only ever see in nature documentaries. But our perspective on it had been forever changed. When we finally made it back to civilization a few days later, the experience felt almost surreal, like a dream we had all shared. We had gone to Alaska to witness one of the most majestic events in the natural world, and we had certainly gotten what we came for. But the trip also gave us something we hadn't expected. The raw, terrifying power of that stampede, the way the ground trembled beneath our feet, and the absolute certainty that we had come within inches of being trampled into nothingness was a humbling and horrifying experience. It was a stark reminder that when you step into the true wilderness, you are not a visitor or an observer. You are just another small, fragile part of it, playing by a very different and much older set of rules, and you are never, ever truly in control. There are some nights that just stick with you, not like a good memory, but like a scar. They become a part of your story, a dark chapter you can't ever tear out. For me and my older brother, that night was in June of 2010. I've always preferred hammock camping over sleeping in a tent. It's lighter to carry, easier to set up, and it keeps you off the cold, hard ground. It was our preferred way to disappear into the woods for a weekend, a tradition we had for years. But after what happened at the Albert Pike Recreation Area, the simple act of tying a rope to a tree feels completely different. You might have heard about the flash flood that happened there way back 2010. It was a real tragedy that made the national news. Well, we were there, and we were the lucky ones. Looking back, the whole thing started so normally that it's hard to reconcile with how it ended. I was 19 at the time, my brother was 22, and we had been on dozens of camping trips together, always choosing remote spots where we could fish and be away from everything. That summer, we decided on Albert Pike in Arkansas, a beautiful place deep in the Ouachita National Forest with pine trees and the little Missouri River snaking through the mountains. My brother was always the cautious one, the planner. Before we left, he checked the weather forecast and saw predictions for heavy rain and thunderstorms for our first night. That didn't really bother us since our enclosed hammocks and rain tarps were perfect for that kind of weather. But my brother insisted on one rule, a single decision that I have no doubt is the only reason I'm able to tell this story today. He was adamant that we set up our camp at least 200 yards away from the river, just in case the water decided to rise a little. When we actually got to Albert Pike that afternoon on June 10th, the main campground was more crowded than we liked. There were families in RVs and kids running around, a scene that felt too much like the civilization we were trying to escape. So we hiked further down the river, away from the designated loops, until we found the perfect spot. It was secluded and quiet, with thick, sturdy oak and pine trees that were perfect for hanging our hammocks. And the sound of the river was just a gentle murmur in the distance. We spent the rest of the afternoon fishing and getting everything ready before nightfall. And by the time the sun started to dip below the mountains, we had a solid setup. Our hammocks were tied between two strong trees about 4 feet off the ground, with our rain tarps pulled taut above them to drain away any water. We had done this 100 times before, and despite the forecast, we weren't worried in the slightest. Lying in my hammock that night, I remember feeling pretty peaceful at first. The storm didn't even start until close to midnight, and I just lay there listening to the steady rhythm of raindrops hitting my tarp. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan around us, but our setup held firm against the weather. It was the kind of sound that usually helps me sleep, just the raw noise of nature and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. By 2 a.m., I was in a deep sleep, completely oblivious to the catastrophe that was unfolding just a short distance away. I don't know what it was that woke me up, maybe a sound or just a feeling. But my first conscious thought was that the bottom of my hammock was wet. My first instinct was to grab my headlamp, which I had clipped to the roof of my enclosed hammock. I fumbled for it snapped it onto my head, and switched it on. I was still half asleep, disoriented. I shifted, thinking maybe my tarp had leaked, maybe some rain had blown in. But when I pressed my hand down, it wasn't just damp. It was cold, moving water. It was in that moment of confused panic that I heard my brother's voice, loud and urgent from his hammock nearby, shouting for me to get up right now. I fumbled with the zipper of my hammock and swung my legs over the side, expecting to land on damp ground. Instead, my feet splashed down into waist-deep, freezing water that was rushing past me with a terrifying force. My brother already had his headlamp on, its beams sweeping over the flooded ground below us, illuminating a swirling, muddy current that had appeared out of nowhere. The river had risen faster than I could have ever imagined, and the water was already licking at the bottom of our hammocks. I thought about just jumping and trying to swim for higher ground, but my brother screamed at me not to do it, that the current would just take me. Instead, he pointed his light straight up into the branches of the tree his hammock was tied to, and shouted at me to climb right now. Panic is a strange thing. It wanted me to jump into the water, to try and outswim the flood, but my brother's voice cut through the fear. So I didn't think, I just climbed. My hands gripped the wet bark of the thick tree, my feet scrambling for any sturdy hold I could find. My brother was already ahead of me, pulling himself up the trunk of his own tree with a desperate urgency. Below us, the water just kept rising with an incredible speed, the deep rushing sound turning into a deafening roar that swallowed everything. I could hear the sickening crack of smaller trees snapping and the grinding sound of boulders being tossed around in the current. At one point, a whole propane tank from someone's campsite rushed past us in the dark. Our entire campsite was just gone, our fire pit and gear consumed by the churning water. By the time I reached the first solid branch, the flood was already up to my chest, and every few minutes it would surge again, climbing even higher. Lightning would flash across the sky, giving me brief, terrifying glimpses of the dark water below. A churning nightmare of snapped branches and debris. For what felt like hours, all we could do was hold on, climbing higher whenever the water surged. I had stopped keeping track of time, my entire world reduced to the rough bark of the tree and the burning ache in my arms and shoulders. My hands were raw and bleeding, but stopping was never an option. I could barely see my brother anymore in the torrential rain, just a dark shape in another tree somewhere above me. By what I think was around 5 a.m., the water must have been at least 20 feet high, a raging river where a forest floor had been just a few hours before. It was around then that the tree I was clinging to shifted beneath me. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it tilted again. A slow, sickening groan of wood and roots being ripped loose from the saturated ground. The current had weakened the soil, and the tree I was on was starting to fall, leaning inch by agonizing inch toward the flood. I knew if it went down, it would take me with it, straight into the churning debris below. There was only one option left for me. I spotted another tree about 4 feet away, a thicker, sturdier one with strong branches just within reach, and I knew it was my only chance. I took a deep breath, gritted my teeth against the cold, and leapt across the gap with every ounce of strength I had left. I miscalculated the jump in the dark and hit the branches hard, my side slamming into the wood and my arms scrambling to catch anything I could. My fingers finally caught a group of thin branches, and I held on for dear life, my body dangling in the air as pain shot through me. Something in my right hand felt deeply wrong. A hot, sickening pain that was different from the scrapes and bruises. I looked at my hand and saw with a surge of nausea that 2 of my fingers were dislocated, bent at an unnatural angle. I clenched my jaw against the pain and forced myself to keep climbing, eventually pulling my battered body onto a thicker branch and pressing my back against the trunk, just breathing hard. After a while, the rain started to slow down, and as the sky began to lighten, we could see that the water below us was no longer rising. The long, cold wait for the water to recede was almost as agonizing as the climb itself. As we sat shivering and stiff in our separate trees, every muscle screaming in protest. Getting down was harder than climbing up, with my dislocated fingers making every movement a fresh wave of pain. When I finally stepped onto the muddy, solid ground, my legs almost gave out from under me. We looked around for what was left of our gear, but there was nothing. Our entire campsite had been washed away without a trace. The tree I had jumped from had completely uprooted and collapsed into the mud, right where I would have been if I hadn't made that jump. As we started the long, slow walk back toward the main road through a landscape of utter devastation, the horrifying reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We hadn't just survived a bad storm. We had barely escaped a historic disaster. When we finally reached civilization, we learned the full scope of what had happened. The flood had hit the main Albert Pike campground so fast that campers, families with kids, had no time to escape. The Little Missouri River had risen over 20 feet in less than 4 hours, and it had wiped out everything in its path. That number, 20 people. It still haunts me to this day. We had set up our camp just a little further down the river, a little higher up the bank. If we had stayed at the main camping area, if we had been anywhere lower, if my brother hadn't insisted on setting up 200 yards away from the water, we would have been among the dead. I haven't been back to Albert Pike since that day, and my brother and I don't camp near rivers anymore. A lot of people don't understand how fast the water can take you, how 1 second you can be asleep and dreaming, and the next you can be just inches away from drowning in the dark. And every time it rains hard now, I wonder if some other camper, somewhere out there, is making the same mistake that we almost did. As a scientist, I've always been trained to look for logical explanations for things. In my line of work, you learn that every strange phenomenon, every seemingly impossible event, usually has a rational, scientific reason behind it if you just dig deep enough. I've always loved the order of it, the way the scientific method could take a terrifying mystery and turn it into a neat, understandable fact. Folklore and legends were just that to me. Fascinating cultural artifacts, stories people told to explain a world they didn't yet have the tools to understand. At least, that's the principle I built my life on. But what happened to my team and I, deep in the Amazon back in 2005, is something that I still don't have an answer for. A memory that sits outside the boundaries of everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It's the one piece of data that I can't explain away, no matter how hard I try. The opportunity came up when I was in college, working on my degree in ecology and rainforest biodiversity. My program involved real field work, and a few of my classmates and I got the chance to go on a research expedition to Madidi National Park in Bolivia, which is one of the most biologically diverse places on the entire planet. There were 6 of us students in total, myself, the 2 thrill seekers named Kyle and Jenna, and a few other quiet, studious types, plus 2 experienced local jungle guides named Mateo and Carlos. we arrived in Rurenabake, a small gateway town to the rainforest that felt like the last outpost of civilization. From there, we took a motorized canoe on a long 3-hour ride down the Beni and Twichi rivers, deeper and deeper into the heart of Madidi. That boat ride is something I'll never forget. The further we went, the more the signs of humanity disappeared, replaced by a solid, impenetrable wall of green on either side of the muddy water. We saw caimans sunning themselves on the riverbanks, their eyes watching us pass with an ancient stillness, and scarlet macaws would occasionally fly overhead in a brilliant flash of color. The drone of the small motor was the only thing that felt familiar. Whenever our guides would cut the engine for a moment, the sound of the jungle would rush in, a deafening, overwhelming chorus of insects, birds, and unseen things that made the hair on your arms stand up. I had seen photos and watched documentaries my whole life, but nothing can prepare you for the sheer, crushing scale of the Amazon. The air is thick and heavy with humidity, and the massive canopy trees block out the sky, making you feel like you're in a world of its own, a world that was ancient before people ever existed. The further we went, the more I felt the modern world peeling away, leaving a feeling of profound isolation that was both exhilarating and deeply unnerving. Our first couple of days in the jungle were everything we'd hoped for. A perfect blend of exhausting work and incredible discovery. We hiked deep into the forest, meticulously setting up camera traps to track wildlife and collecting samples of medicinal plants, my mind buzzing with the sheer volume of life around. I remember on the second day, our lead guide, Mateo, showed us a specific type of tree with a dark, heavy wood that was rich in a fragrant resin. He explained that the local tribes considered it sacred, that they would burn it as a torch because they believed the thick, aromatic smoke would ward off malos spiritus, the evil spirits that were said to live in the deepest, darkest parts of the jungle where humans weren't welcome. He spoke of them not as myths, but as a real and present danger, a part of the forest's ecosystem that you had to respect and avoid. We all just kind of nodded along, treating it as an interesting piece of local folklore, a fascinating cultural belief to jot down in our field notes. What I didn't realize then was how soon we would see that folklore put into terrifying practice. It was on the morning of our third and final day that things started to go sideways. Kyle and Jenna, who were always the thrill seekers of the group, got it in their heads that they wanted the guides to take us somewhere completely untouched by tourists, a hidden spot deeper in the jungle. The guides immediately refused, their usual friendly demeanor replaced with a stern seriousness. Mateo was adamant that we had to stay on the known paths that they had mapped and understood. He tried to explain that the Amazon isn't a place to mess around in, that there are very good reasons why some areas are left unexplored, reasons that were older than any of us. But my classmates wouldn't drop it, and eventually the rest of the group joined in, even offering to pay the guides extra for the risk. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing, a nagging worry in the back of my mind that I couldn't silence. But I also didn't want to be the only one to stay behind at the camp alone, the one who was too scared. So against my better judgment, I went along with them, a silent accomplice in our own stupidity. Thinking back on the hike to that so-called hidden paradise, I mostly remember how hard it was to breathe. The jungle didn't feel like it wanted us there. The undergrowth was dense and tangled, catching on our clothes, and the air was so thick with humidity, it was like wading through water. After about an hour of that struggle, the trees just sort of opened up, and we were there. It was a crystal clear lagoon, I'll admit, surrounded by these massive, ancient-looking trees. A place that felt like it had been sleeping for 1,000 years. For a moment, seeing a place so untouched, I think my unease faded a little as we all just stood there in the quiet. We spent some time exploring the area and taking notes, but I couldn't shake a bad feeling, mostly because our guides never really relaxed. They stayed on the edge of the clearing the whole time, their eyes constantly scanning the canopy, as if they were listening for something we couldn't hear. It was almost as if the place itself decided we had been there long enough, because the weather started to turn with a sudden, unnatural speed. The sky just darkened as these heavy storm clouds rolled in from nowhere, and the rain started as a light drizzle before turning into a torrential downpour, making our simple return trip a slow, slippery ordeal through the rapidly disappearing light. It was as we were struggling through the mud that the first truly strange thing happened. All the normal sounds of the jungle, the insects, the birds, the frogs, they all just went silent at once. The only sound left was the drumming of the rain and the distant howling of monkeys. At first, the sound was far away, just faint screeches echoing through the trees. But as we moved, the sound grew closer and louder. And when we looked up, we could see the silhouettes of monkeys high in the canopy, moving in frantic, erratic patterns. This was different from any primate behavior I had ever studied. They were agitated, angry, and seemingly terrified of something. Our guide Mateo stopped walking and whispered something in Spanish, his grip tightening on his machete. He turned to us and told us in a hushed, urgent voice to turn on every light we had. Then, to my astonishment, he pulled out a piece of that same resin-rich wood he had shown us the day before and lit it with a lighter, the flame catching quickly and producing a thick, aromatic smoke. The monkeys were screeching so loudly now that it was disorienting, a chaotic chorus from multiple species all around us. Then they started throwing things at us, twigs and fruits at first, but then stones, some of them big enough to cause real harm. It was in the middle of this chaos that an awful smell hit us, a thick, cloying stench like rotting meat mixed with the musk of a wet animal, and something like swamp gas that grew stronger with every second. The smell of decay was so overwhelming that I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the monkeys scattered and fled in an instant. The jungle around us fell completely dead quiet, the only sound left being the rain and our own ragged breathing. That's when we heard it, a deep, heavy thud from the canopy above us, followed by another. Something big was moving through the trees. We all froze, our lights pointing up into the canopy as we tried to see what was making the sound. It moved with a speed and agility that wasn't human, but also wasn't like any animal we recognized. It was leaping from tree to tree, the branches groaning under a weight that seemed impossible. My scientific brain was racing through every known species in the region, trying to categorize it. The weight displacement was all wrong for a jaguar. The speed was wrong for a sloth. It was the movement of a massive arboreal primate in a place on Earth where they simply do not exist. And that's what made my blood run cold. My mind reeled with the biological certainty of the fact. There are no great apes in the Amazon. The largest primates here are spider monkeys, maybe 30 pounds at most. But this was massive. Then it stopped moving, and one of the guides whispered something that made my stomach drop into my feet. He said it was blending in. We stood there frozen, our lights scanning the canopy, knowing that we were being watched by something we couldn't see. And then, a massive branch, thicker than my torso, snapped from a tree above us and came crashing down. Mateo shoved us back just in time as the branch slammed into the ground where we had been standing, splintering into 1,000 pieces. And then the guide just shouted at us to run. We took off blindly through the dark, following the flickering light of Mateo's resin torch. I could hear branches cracking behind us and the heavy movement in the trees keeping pace with us. It wasn't just following us, it was hunting us. The ground was muddy and slick, and I stumbled more than once, barely keeping my balance as my heart pounded in my chest. Somewhere behind us, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees, a sound that didn't belong to any known animal. I have no real memory of how long we ran, just that it felt endless. The jungle was a nightmare of dark trees and slick mud, our flashlights cutting wild, panicked arcs in the rain. But then a faint light appeared ahead, a small beacon in the overwhelming darkness. It was our camp. We could hear Carlos's voice cutting through the noise, his words frantic, pushing us to keep moving to get there faster. As we threw our gear together in a panic, I kept glancing back toward the jungle. But I knew it was still out there, just watching and waiting. The short trek from our ruined camp back to the river was the longest 600 yards of my life. We were halfway there when I heard another loud crack in the trees behind us, the sound of immense weight shifting. We practically threw ourselves onto the boat, shoving off the moment the last person was aboard. I remembered the sound of the engine finally roaring to life. Felt like the first breath you take after being underwater for too long. With that sound of escape finally in our ears, we all slowly turned to look back at the dark, silent jungle shoreline. Our eyes couldn't see anything out of the ordinary in the trees. But that didn't matter, because we could all still feel it there, a heavy presence watching us as we finally pulled away into the current. We didn't speak for a long time after that, just sat in a shared, heavy silence as we moved down the river, watching the jungle slowly fade into a dark line behind us. The guides, usually so calm and composed, looked visibly shaken. Then one of them finally gave it a name I had only ever read about in books on local mythology. The Mapinguari. I had always known it as an ancient Amazonian legend, a giant ape-like beast that wasn't supposed to exist. As a scientist, my brain is still trying to find a rational explanation for what we saw and heard that night. But for the first time in my life, I'm forced to admit that I don't have one. We had gone into the jungle looking for untouched nature, but instead, we found something ancient and powerful that insisted on remaining untouched. That's all I have for y'all now. My voice will be gone in a moment, and all that will remain is the whisper of the flames. Try to let it soothe you, and try to get some rest. Just be sure your doors are locked. Until next time,